Alright, what's going on everyone, and welcome to the series in which I introduce you to all of the most powerful competitive decks in the modern format. Today we're looking at Esper Reanimator, a somewhat new deck, new since Modern Horizons 2 was released, and currently Modern's top Reanimator deck. So, if you aren't familiar with the term, a Reanimator deck is looking to cheese a big creature into play by returning it to the battlefield from the graveyard. Typically there's a cheap reanimation spell that returns something from the graveyard, and then you're trying to get some big giant creature into the graveyard so you can get this out as soon as possible. This is what a Reanimator deck is typically looking to do. So what creature is Esper Reanimator trying to reanimate? Well, that is Archon of Cruelty, which this might not seem that impressive. It's a little bit underwhelming considering how many big crazy creatures exist in Modern, right? There's so many giant massive creatures. Why are we reanimating a 6/6 flyer? Well, the reason this is Modern's premier reanimation target is it is an absolute value machine. So when it enters the battlefield or attacks, the opponent has to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, discard a card, and they lose 3 life, and then you draw a card and gain 3 life. Now that's a ton of value, and it fixes the big problem with many reanimation decks. A lot of times you spend a couple turns setting up, and setting up a reanimation deck is hard because you're spending cards to get something into your graveyard. You gotta spend a card to reanimate it. You go down in card advantage, and yes, you do get a really big creature at the end of it, but then your opponent can just kill it with a removal spell, and that's it. But with Archon, even if it gets killed immediately, it generates so much value that it doesn't matter too much if it dies. I mean, if your opponent instantly kills it with a removal spell, they still have to sacrifice a creature, they still discard a card, you still draw another card, and you're still going to drain 3. And if the Archon doesn't die, holy crap is that devastating, because remember, all of these effects also trigger every single time it attacks. So not only do you get all the stuff when it hits the battlefield, the following turn, if it hits once, you get all that stuff again. You get another card, they have to discard another card, they have to sacrifice something else. It's kind of crazy, and it also makes this more powerful than what it might first appear because, yes, it's just a 6/6 flyer, but if it attacks once, when it enters, they lose 3. When it attacks for 6, and then it drains for another 3. So technically, if you get one attack with it, it's effectively dealing 12 damage, and also you're gaining 6, not to mention all the sacrificing and discarding and drawing. So it actually has more raw power than it might seem at first glance. So now that we know what the deck is trying to reanimate, how does it go about achieving this? Well, first, to get the Archon in the graveyard, we have Faithful Mending and Unmarked Grave. Faithful Mending is just draw 2, discard 2. It helps you find, the Archon, it helps you discard the Archon. Also gain some life against aggro decks, so that's nice. And don't forget that it has flashback, so each copy that you draw effectively draws 4, discards 4, because you can cast it twice. So that's nice. But they can also help you find Unmarked Grave, which 2 mana, search your library for any creature, put it directly into the graveyard. It technically can't be a legend, but that's fine. Archon's not a legend, and also it's only 2 mana. So 2 mana, guaranteed way to get the Archon in the graveyard with a single card is very nice. So, now that we have the Archon in the graveyard, how do we get it back? And for that we have Persist, Unburial Rites, and Priest of Fell Rites. Persist returns the creature for just 2 mana. Very little mana. It does get a -1/-1 counter, but I mean 2 mana to get that Archon back is pretty crazy. Unburial Rites is a little bit more expensive, but it can be cast twice. Also, if you have it in your hand, you can discard it to Faithful Mending, and it technically costs less in your graveyard, so that's nice. Also, it can just be cast multiple times in a game, right? If your opponent kills the Archon, the Unburial Rites is still in your graveyard, you can just reanimate it again. And Priest of Fell Rites, this one's interesting. So you can sacrifice it to reanimate the Archon, but more importantly, it has Unearth. So Unearth means you can pay the cost and return it to the battlefield with haste, but it gets exiled at the end of turn. But what this offers is consistency, because if you already have multiple Archons in the graveyard, you can actually use Unmarked Grave to find the priest instead. So Unmarked Grave can find both your payoff and your enabler. The fact that your reanimation target and your reanimator can be found with the same card is very nice. Nice to have that little bit of overlap. Plus, another great thing about Priest of Fall Rites, of course, much like Unburial Rites, it can reanimate multiple times. And with all the value that Archon generates, that's just powerful even if it never gets to attack. Like if you're playing against a black deck with tons of spot removal, the fact that you can just reanimate it, and each time you're getting all that value, that's pretty good. So as you can see, ideally you can get this Archon out on turn 3, right? Because you can either play the Priest on turn 2, and then you can play Unmarked Grave, get the Archon on turn 3 and reanimate it instantly, or you can play Unmarked Grave on turn 2 and then persist it on turn 3, right? Right guys? Right? Turn 3 Archon, that's pretty good. Wrong. That's not good enough because this deck has a clever trick. It's playing Thoughtseize. So this is a very popular hand disruption spell. If you're familiar with Modern, you're probably familiar with Thoughtseize. One of the best hand disruption spells in the format. Makes the opponent discard a card, or doesn't make the opponent discard a card. It says target player. So you can actually target yourself, discard the Archon on turn 1, and then persist it on turn 2. And even with the -1/-1 counter, a turn 2 5/5 flyer that drains 3, makes the opponent discard and sacrifice, and draws you a card is pretty good. It's very good. So actually, Archon, possible to get it on turn 2 with a nut draw. The deck also plays Ephemerate, and this has a ton of uses in this deck. So first off, it exiles a creature you control, then returns it to the battlefield. So basically, it allows you to re-trigger your Archon. For 1 mana, you can target your Archon and get all of that stuff, and you can actually do the second main phase, right? You can attack with it, get all those triggers, then second main phase, you can blink it. Sure, it doesn't come in with haste, but it'll be able to attack the following turn. That's certainly possible, but that's the silly way to use it. The proper use is to use this as a counter spell, kind of. So if you use this in response to a removal spell, it blanks the removal spell. The removal spell fizzles. So if the opponent hits it with, this removal spell, if you play Ephemerate and blink it, the removal spell actually loses its target and doesn't resolve. So this not only counters removal spells, but it severely punishes your opponent for trying to remove the Archon, because when you counter it, right, when you counter the removal spell, the Archon's abilities all re-trigger. So it's like going from bad to worse. Not only is your removal spell getting countered, but also now you have to sacrifice discard, you drain 3, and the other person gets to draw. So it can actually generate a ton of value while also protecting your main reanimation target. Oh, and I didn't mention, Ephemerate has rebound, meaning if you wish, you can blink again the following turn. Ideally, you just attack with the Archon, but if your opponent has a bigger creature in the air to block with, you just let that rebound trigger bounce again and get another sacrifice, get another card, discard, all that stuff. So Ephemerate, pretty good, but it also is a really spicy combo with Grief. So this is like Thoughtseize. It's a 5-mana creature that makes the opponent discard, but it has Evoke, and Evoke means you can pay the Evoke cost, which in this case is exiling a card, but if you evoke it, it gets sacrificed immediately. Basically, you evoke it, you put it onto the battlefield, you get that enter the battlefield effect, but then it gets sacrificed. However, with Ephemerate, you can evoke Grief onto the battlefield, get that effect to make the opponent discard, then you Ephemerate and you blink it. It's going to re-enter, so the opponent's going to have to discard 2 cards, and it actually won't get sacrificed. So basically, for 1 white mana on turn 1, you can make the opponent discard 2 cards, and you get to keep the 3/2 menace, plus you have the rebound. So if you rebound it the following turn, for 1 white mana, you make the opponent discard 3 cards, and you get a 3/2 with menace. That effect is so powerful that the deck is also playing Solitude and Mulldrifter, and to be fair, a lot of decks are playing Solitude, but Solitude, it's a removal spell. It can be blinked with Ephemerate. You don't even have to do the evoke thing. If you just have it on the battlefield, Ephemerate effectively kills 2 creatures, because you blink your Solitude the following turn, you rebound it, blink it again, another thing removed. That's pretty powerful. Mole Drifter gets crazy. If you evoke it for 3, you draw 2. Then you ephemerate it, draw 2 more. The following turn, you rebound ephemerate to draw 2 more. So 1 Mole Drifter for 3 mana draws 6 cards. And all of this is actually what makes this deck so powerful as a Reanimator deck. You have Thoughtseize, Grief, and the Archon to absolutely rip through people's hands. This deck can tear people's hands apart like nothing. It's also very good at taking removal out of your opponent's hand so they can't kill your Archon. Get to look at their hand, just wipe out all the removal. Then you have Faithful Mending, Mole Drifter, and the Archon once again to dig and generate card advantage. Faithful Mending doesn't generate card advantage, it's draw 2, discard 2, but there's a lot of digging, there's a lot of card advantage, there's a lot of drawing, and Reanimator decks are not usually good at this sort of stuff. Reanimator decks typically go down in card advantage trying to cheese their big creature in play. That's how they work. You don't win the card advantage game. You're just trying to get a janky big creature in play super quick, and that's supposed to be how Reanimator decks work. But this deck is actually a card advantage machine. It controls the opponent's hand, it draws tons of cards, and also it has a big giant creature that it can reanimate on turn 2. So while this is a reanimation deck, it also just kind of feels like a control deck. At the very least, it can kill lots of stuff, it can draw lots of cards, and that's not typical for this archetype. But that's why Archon has been so successful. It's because it doesn't fit the mold of a typical reanimation deck. It's a reanimation deck that doesn't go down in card advantage, which is just very odd. There are some other cards you'll see in the deck. It'll play like Teferi and Prismatic Ending. Teferi, of course, lets you reanimate at instant speed and makes it difficult for your opponent to interact by only allowing them to interact at sorcery speed. And the Prismatic Ending is just a removal spell, one of the most popular white removal spells in Modern. You also occasionally see Sarah's Emissary as an extra reanimation target. If a deck is playing this, it typically plays 1. Also frequently plays them in the sideboard. It's very good against certain decks because, first off, it's a big giant flyer, so that's nice. But when it enters, you get to name a card type, and then you have protection from that card type and your creatures. So like you can name instants against burn and basically turn off all their burn spells. You can name creatures. You're playing against Enchantress, you can name enchantments and they can't enchant your stuff, stuff like that. So can absolutely brick wall certain decks, which is why sometimes you see 1. You can use Unmarked Grave to get it if you think it's critical in that matchup. Alternatively, it's in the sideboard and you can bring it in if necessary. So yeah, guys, that is Esper Reanimator. The deck can reanimate an Archon as early as turn 2, resulting in 12 total damage if you can't kill it that turn. It can rip the opponent's hand to shreds, it can draw more cards than the opponent, it can fizzle removal spells, and it can punish the opponent when that happens, and it can also just aggro you out with a turn 1 grief if you have a slow start. If you mulligan a couple times and they get the turn 1 grief, it's like your hand's gone basically. So that's it, guys. That's Esper Reanimator. You can find links in the description for the most up-to-date deck lists if you're interested, as there are always multiple builds and some variation from deck to deck. Also in the description is a link to the Intro to Modern playlist with more videos just like this one, so check that out if you want to see more. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.